Hello, everybody. Welcome to our web briefing on the 6th Annual Global Terrorism Index. Check our audio to begin. You should have a chat box open on the side of your screen. If you can hear me, please enter a 1 into your chat box, just so we can get a sense that everybody can hear us. Tom, can you speak and we'll just test your audio?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Can everyone hear me okay?
Great. I'm seeing a lot of 1s, so we're going to get started. I appreciate that you guys took the time to join us online today. My name is Michelle Breslauer. I run the programs here in the Americas region for the Institute for Economics and Peace. I am based in New York City, and I'm joined to present our terrorism index by Thomas Morgan, who's a senior research fellow with the Institute for Economics and Peace, and he's joining us today from London. So I know that everybody's coming from a different time zone, a different job, and a different point, but we hope that today will give you an understanding of not only how this index is put together, but what some of the key findings are, and give a chance for you to ask your questions about the work that we're doing. The index that we publish, the full report, as well as an interactive map, are both available online. If you go to our communications platform, the website visionofhumanity.org, you'll be able to access all the resources that we're referencing today. We have the full methodology for the index listed in the back of the report, and we'll Excel spreadsheets with the data to researchers in the field who are looking for additional information for their work. So just to begin, the Institute for Economics and Peace is an independent, not-for-profit think tank, and we're dedicated to building a greater understanding of the key drivers of peace and identifying the economic benefits that increased peacefulness can deliver. And we're doing this generally in 2 ways. One is through our data-driven research, the series of indices, for instance, that we publish annually, as well as smaller data briefs, but also through communications. And I think this is really important because what IEP is trying to do is bring these measures of peace into the broader consciousness. And to that end, we invest a fair amount of resources in clearly communicating some of the findings from this work so that people start thinking about where we are in terms of our levels of peacefulness. You'll see here that we have a fair amount of media reach. Each year we're reaching at least 5 billion people through media impressions. We have 6 offices internationally that promote the work. I'm here in New York. We have an office in Mexico City, 1 in Sydney, 1 in The Hague, 1 in Brussels, and 1 in Zimbabwe. And our global digital reach each year is 800 million people. Our research is used extensively by a variety of international organizations and research organizations. And we've been ranked as one of the 15 most impactful think tanks for our size on the Global Go-To Think Tank Index. So we're really working not only to do the data analysis, but also to communicate it. And I mention this because I think it's particularly important in the context of terrorism. Terrorism is a form of violence, a tactic of violence that's meant to instill fear in the general population. So it has a much broader impact and reach than other types of violence might. And to that end, it's even more important to have this evidence base delivered annually to really understand what's happening in the world in terms of terrorism. Where is the greater impact? What are the threats actually? So this is the 6th year of the Terrorism Index. We're ranking 163 countries according to their relative impact of terrorism. And we actually take this entire index and we build it into one of 23 indicators used in our annual Global Peace Index that comes out each June. The Institute for Economics and Peace develops the index. We use data coming from the START Center at the University of Maryland. They develop an annual global terrorism database, and Tom will talk a little bit more about that. So we're really using START's definition and data, and we are building the index and doing the analysis. And then we're guided by a panel of experts around the world who focus on peace and conflict studies, statistics, and analysis. I'm going to hand it over to Tom now. What he's going to do is take you through a series of slides that show some of the key findings from this year's index, as well as how we develop it. And then I'll open the briefing up to questions from all of you. So you can start thinking about your questions while Tom is speaking, and you can put them into your chat box, moderating questions that way. So why don't you go ahead, Tom?
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you for that introduction. So there's a lot to go through, a lot to cover here. There's a lot of different aspects of terrorism that we cover in the report. So I do encourage you, if you have any questions or any queries about it, to look at the report in depth, or to, as Michelle said, type your questions up, and we'll try to address as many of them as we can at the end of the presentation. What I'd like to start with first is to look at a little bit about the methodology of the index, how we build the index. So as Michelle said, we're taking data from an organization called START, who put together something called the Global Terrorism Database, which goes back to 1970. And so they collect data on terrorist attacks, terrorist incidents. They code it. There are a lot of variables that they add to it. So we take that data and then we turn it into an index. And the way we do that is, first of all, we assign a weighting to each terrorist incident in the database. So that's to reflect that different terrorist attacks have different intensities, different impacts on society. So we give incidents a weighting of 1. For every injury in a terrorist attack, that gets half weighting. Deaths are weighted as a 3, as the most important element in the impact of terrorism to take into consideration. And then there's also a variable looking at the extent of property damage that an attack causes. And the next thing that we try to capture with regards to the impact of terrorism is the fact that a terrorist attack in a given year won't just have an impact in that year. It will linger for many years. There'll be lasting economic, social, and psychological effects. So to take that into account, we don't just use data from a single year for the index score for that year. We use a weighted average of 5 years. So the most recent year has the greatest weighting, and then the year before that has the second greatest weighting, and so on and so on. And then the next step is to transform that raw score for a country into an index score between 0 and 10. And the major consideration here is to take into account the fact that as the level of terrorism in a country increases, in a sense, the violence becomes normalized, and the impact of terrorism is actually lessened the more terrorism there is. So if you think about a country that goes from having 0 terrorism deaths to 10, and then a country which has 1,000 terrorism deaths going to 1,010, the proportional impact is much greater in the country going from 0 to 10. So to reflect that, we use a logarithmic banding scoring system that transforms that raw terrorism score into an index score from 0 to 10. So that's just a little bit about how the GTI is calculated. So then that gives us, when we've calculated the index, that gives us a score for each country, which we can then correlate against a number of socioeconomic indicators. Then we can start to see what kind of other factors are correlated with terrorism. So that's just a little bit about how the index is put together. So there are 4 areas that we'd like to go through in this presentation. We're going to look at, firstly, some results, some of the key findings from the report. Then we're going to look at the trends over a 20-year period, so to see what the trends have been in terrorism. And then we'll look in a bit more depth in 2 areas. Firstly, looking at some of the emerging hotspots of terrorism, so some of the areas which have had increased levels of terrorism and which we expect to have increased levels of terrorism in the coming years. And then finally looking at a little bit at patterns in terrorist recruitment. So looking at different terrorist groups and what kind of people they're targeting, and covering a little bit around foreign fighters in Syria and foreign fighter returnees and so on. So starting with the key findings. So in this year's index, we found that deaths from terrorism declined by 27% from 2016 to 2017. And if you go back a little bit further, so looking at when deaths from terrorism peaked in 2014, we found that there's been a 44% decline since 2014. Over the past, from 2016 to 2017, there were 94 countries whose scores improved on the Global Terrorism Index, while 46 had a deteriorating impact of terrorism. One area with a particularly large decrease in terrorism deaths was Europe. So we saw from 2016 to 2017, total deaths from terrorism fell by 75%. So those are some of the more encouraging findings from this year's index. With regard to some of the more negative findings, we found that although it's proportionally still a very small percentage of total terrorism, that far-right political terrorism is on the rise, particularly in Western Europe and North America. And despite the fall in the impact of terrorism, terrorism is very much still a global phenomenon. There were 67 countries that suffered at least one death from terrorism. And then if we look at the distribution of countries with higher numbers of deaths, there were 5 countries that recorded more than 1,000 deaths and 19 countries that recorded more than 100 deaths from terrorism in 2017. Although the majority of countries did record an improvement on their GTI score, there were a number of countries with notable deteriorations, the most notable deteriorations being in Somalia and Egypt. And when you look at terrorism more broadly, we find that 99% of terrorism deaths occur in countries which are engaged in a violent conflict or war, or have high levels of state terror, meaning human rights violations, imprisonment without trial, extrajudicial killings, and so on. And we found that there are certain emerging hotspots of terrorism around the world. Terrorism in Southeast Asia is on the rise. In 2017, both in Myanmar and the Philippines, they recorded their highest levels of terrorism since we began constructing the index. But then another two final positive trends to finish off. We found that there's been a lot of attention paid to ISIL over the past 5 years, but deaths committed by ISIL were actually down 52% from 2016 to 2017, although it remains the deadliest terrorist group in the world. And we found that when we look at the countries with the biggest improvement, the largest improvements occurred in Iraq and Syria, which had falls in deaths from terrorism of 5,500 and 1,000 respectively. So just to look a little bit at the overall trend in terrorism over the last 20 years or so, and we found that there's been a number of different waves since the turn of the century, different waves, different patterns in the levels of terrorism. So of course, in 2001, there was the 9/11 attacks in the US. And then in the following 2 years, there was a bit of a fall until the start of the Iraq War. From 2003 until 2006, there was a notable increase in deaths from terrorism, with the majority of those occurring in Iraq. Then with the US troop surge in Iraq, that led to a fall in the level of terrorism, or a plateauing, until 2011, when we see ISIL emerge from the remnants of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And really that was the start of an enormous increase in the level of terrorism. So from 2011, 2012 onwards to 2014, there was an immense spike in the level of terrorism, mostly concentrated in Iraq, but also you saw increases in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Nigeria, and so on. And then the positive trend over the past 3 years has been the decrease in the level of terrorism. We saw a certain amount of we saw a large amount of counter-terrorism activity, and a lot of that has been successful. So we've seen falls in essentially every region around the world. So that just gives you a little bit of an overview of the trends in the last 20 years of terrorism. When we look at the composition of deaths from terrorism in 2017, we see that the country with the single largest percentage of total deaths from terrorism was Afghanistan, which had 25% of all deaths from terrorism in 2017. And in 2017, that was the first time that First time in 5 years that Iraq didn't have the highest number of deaths from terrorism of any country. And in fact, I think going back to 2003, for all but 3 years, Iraq has had the highest number of deaths from terrorism of any country. And so if you look at Afghanistan, Iraq, Nigeria, and Somalia, and Syria, you see that they account for really a majority of terrorist deaths around the world. Looking at those countries which had the largest decreases, as we briefly touched upon before, the largest decrease in deaths from terrorism occurred in Iraq, where there was a quite astonishing fall. Iraq had 5,500 fewer deaths from terrorism recorded in 2017 than it did in 2016. Also in Syria, you saw with the winding down of the civil war in Syria, the cessation of some of the violence there, Syria also had a large fall in the number of deaths from terrorism. With regards to those countries which had the largest increase in deaths from terrorism, the most notable increases occurred in Somalia and Egypt, although it should be noted that in Somalia, and both Somalia and Egypt, that occurred on the back of single large terrorist attacks, the largest and the second largest terrorist attacks in the world in 2017, respectively. So in Somalia, there was a suicide bombing, car bombing attack that killed 588 people in Mogadishu in 2017. And then in Egypt, there was an attack on a mosque by the Sinai province of the Islamic State, which killed 311 people in a single attack. So if we look at which terrorist groups are responsible for the most deaths, and this chart looks at the trend in the 4 deadliest terrorist groups in 2017, how those deaths have increased over the past 20 years. So we see that ISIL remains the world's deadliest terrorist group. However, having said that, they had a 52% drop in deaths from 2016 to 2017, which is quite a noticeable drop. You can see a similar trend for Boko Haram, who operate mostly in Nigeria. Although their decline started a little bit earlier, they've had a similar percentage drop in the number of deaths from terrorism. In Afghanistan, the Taliban is now the second deadliest terrorist group in the world in 2017, and they've had actually sort of a sustained level of terrorism. The level of both terrorism and violent deaths has actually increased in Afghanistan as it's been going down elsewhere in the world. And you have a similar situation with Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate group in Somalia. Even as terrorism has been dropping around the world, the number of deaths from terrorism and the number of incidents carried out by Al-Shabaab has been increasing. So the second section that we want to talk a little bit about is some of the trends in terrorism that we've seen over the past 20 years. So if we look at the trends regionally, we see that by far the majority of terrorism deaths have occurred in 3 regions around the world: in the Middle East and North Africa, in South Asia, and in Sub-Saharan Africa, with just over 90,000, just under 60,000, and just over 40,000 deaths, respectively. And those 3 regions account for 92% of all deaths from terrorism for the period 2002 to 2017. One of the major findings that's been consistent over the entire course of the index is that the majority of deaths from terrorism occur in countries which are suffering from conflict. So this chart shows the number of deaths occurring in countries which are in a state of war, which is defined by UCP as a country which has over 1,000 battle deaths in a calendar year. The number of deaths occurring in countries with a minor armed conflict, which is between 25 and 1,000 deaths in a calendar year, battle deaths, and then countries with the state of no conflict. So you can see there by far the majority of deaths from terrorism occur in countries in a state of war, followed by countries in a minor armed conflict. And as we touched upon at the start, if you then incorporate countries which have high levels of state repression, human rights abuses, and so on, we find that 99% of all deaths from terrorism occur in countries in a state of conflict or with high levels of political terror. And we find that not only the level, but the trends, the dynamics between battle deaths and deaths from terrorism are very closely linked. So this is an index chart. It's not showing the total number of deaths, rather it's showing the relative change year on year since 2001. So if we look at deaths from terrorism and battle deaths since 2001, we see that between 2001 and 2014, both of those types of deaths had around a 400% increase. And since 2014, there's also been an almost equivalent drop over the same time period. And we see that quite tight relationship between battle deaths and deaths from terrorism. If we look at the country level specifically too, so these 6 charts look at deaths from terrorism and battle deaths in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Nigeria, Somalia, Syria, and Pakistan. And you can see a fairly close relationship in the trend. Sorry, Michelle?
Can you please speak more clearly into your microphone with an audio issue? And just repeat yourself. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So yes, sorry, I was saying we see that there's a tight relationship between deaths from terrorism and battle deaths, not only for the world as a whole, but also if we're looking at those countries which are most impacted by terrorism. So very close relationship between those two variables in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Nigeria, in Somalia, and in Pakistan. And the only country which really doesn't have as close a relationship is Syria, where the total number of deaths in the Syrian civil war has really heavily outweighed the number of deaths from terrorism in Syria, even though there's been a considerable increase in the number of deaths from terrorism in Syria as well. One of the areas that we looked at in this year's report that we had a particular focus on was deaths from terrorism in Western Europe and North America, because attacks in those two regions tend to receive a lot of media coverage. And even though they make up a very small percentage of total deaths from terrorism, there has been a considerable increase in deaths from terrorism in those two regions. So you've seen in Western Europe from 2014 to 2017, this chart shows that considerable increase, although there was a drop of 75% in deaths from terrorism in Europe as a whole from 2016 to 2017. And then in North America as well, we've seen an increase in the number of deaths from terrorism every year from 2013 to 2017. So if we look at who's responsible for those deaths in those two regions, we find that the majority of those deaths were caused by ISIL, either directly or they were ISIL-inspired attacks. So these are individuals who claim to be carrying terrorist attacks out in the name of ISIL. They had some direction, some contact, or were inspired by ISIL. And the final slide that we're looking at in the trends section, we had a section this year looking at the rise of far-right political terrorism. And so we found there that there's a worrying trend in, there's been an increase in the number of far-right political terrorist attacks and deaths from terrorism, particularly in the last 3 years or so, although there's been a steady increase since around 2011. So if you look at far-right terrorism attacks in Western Europe, they've increased from just 3 in 2014 up to 28 in 2017. You see a similar increase in North America, so an increase from 7 attacks in 2014 to 31 attacks in 2017. There's been a similar increase in the number of deaths as well. So in total, there were 50 across those two regions, Western Europe and North America. We've had 59 incidents of far-right political terrorism, which resulted in 17 deaths. And again, although this constitutes a very small percentage of total attacks and total deaths from terrorism, the sustained increase in the number of incidents is certainly a cause for concern and one of the key findings from this year's report. So we're going to move on briefly, just touching on the last two sections of the 2018 GTI. The first is looking at the shifting landscape of terrorism. So one of the major trends in terrorism has been the military defeat of ISIL. So these two charts show the decline in ISIL's average monthly revenue from 2015 to 2017, and also in the territory that they control from 2015 to 2017. And so ISIL reportedly lost 60% of its territory and 80% of its revenue from 2015 to 2017. And if we carry that forward, and with the latest available data, we find that I think now the estimate is that ISIL has lost all but now controls less than 5% of the territory it controlled in 2015, and possibly as little as 1%. And so what's happened as ISIL has lost territory, lost financial resources in the Middle East and North Africa, particularly in Iraq and Syria. We find that resources are being diverted elsewhere. And so we start to see that there are some other emerging hotspots of terrorism. So as the center of terrorism moves out of the Middle East, we've seen an increase in terrorist activity in 3 regions. In the Maghreb and the Sahel regions in Africa, we found there's been a small increase in ISIL activity, but also a kind of reformation and regrouping of Al-Qaeda. There's been a considerable increase in Al-Qaeda activity in the Sahel. We found that even though terrorist activity by Boko Haram has decreased in Nigeria, there's been an increase in terrorism and targeting of civilians by the Fulani extremists from the Fulani pastoral group in the conflict between Fulani pastoralists and farmers in Nigeria's Middle Belt. And then the third emerging hotspot that we found is in Southeast Asia. So as we briefly alluded to at the start, both Myanmar and the Philippines had record high numbers of deaths from terrorism in 2017. So we'll touch briefly on those 3 areas. In Southeast Asia, as this chart shows, there's been an increase in terrorist attacks and terrorist deaths caused by Islamist terrorist groups, but also a considerable increase in deaths and attacks from separatist groups, from nationalist separatist groups, political groups as well. So if we look at the next slide, it shows the dispersion of terrorism across. Yes, Michelle?
Please repeat monitoring your audio.
No worries.
It went a little bit funky.
Well, from when?
Just starting with this slide.
Okay. So this slide is showing the geographical dispersion of terrorism across Myanmar and across the Philippines, both which had record numbers of deaths from terrorism in 2017. And really the most remarkable finding here is not only the intensity, but also the geographic spread of terrorism in the Philippines. There were over 170 separate towns and cities in the Philippines that experienced at least 1 death from terrorism in 2017. We've seen that there's been a lot of Islamist-related terrorist activity in Mindanao, but also a considerable amount of terrorist activity from the New People's Army, which is the militant wing of the Communist Party in the Philippines, and was declared a terrorist organization by the Philippines government in 2017. So that's spread throughout the country. So that's probably the most striking finding about the spread of terrorism into Southeast Asia. The next slide just looks at terrorist activity in Nigeria. So we see that as the intensity and the level of terrorist activity by Boko Haram has declined. It peaked in 2014, but then from 2016 to 2018, it decreased. Over that same time period, there's been an increase in terrorism and violence and attacks against civilians that were committed by Fulani extremists. So those are the 3 emerging hotspots of terrorism that IEP identified in the report, in Nigeria's Middle Belt, in the Sahel region, in Africa, and also in some countries in Southeast Asia. So the final section that we want to touch upon in this year's report, we looked at the patterns of terrorist recruitment and how the type of people being targeted by terrorist groups has shifted over the past few years. So there's a group called the ICSR who put out a report in 2016 called Criminal Paths, Terrorist Futures. Criminal Paths, Terrorist Futures came out in late 2016, and that looked at people who had been arrested for terrorist offences, who were either who were either foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq for ISIL, or who had been arrested for terrorism offences and were claiming to act in the name of ISIL in Western Europe. And one of the interesting findings there is it found that depending on the country, between 40% and 60% of those with terrorism arrest offences had prior criminal backgrounds. So there's been a shift here from the typical profile of a terrorist recruit. If you look at, say, the 9/11 hijackers, people involved in terrorism and in Al-Qaeda in the early 2000s, many of them were highly educated. Over 50% of the terrorists involved in the hijackings in 9/11 had a college degree. You'd often find people coming from a legal and medical or an engineering background. However, when you look at those who are been recruited more recently to fight for ISIL. A lot of them have a criminal background, and ISIL is promoting a redemption narrative for people who have been involved in criminal activity. They lack purpose and direction in their lives. Being involved with ISIL allows that redemption narrative, but also from ISIL's perspective, it allows ISIL to take advantage of their criminal skill sets, so to speak, so their experience with violence, experience with criminal activity and raising funds illicitly, and so on. So that was one of the interesting trends that has emerged in terrorist recruitment. One of the other major concerns when it patterns in terrorist recruitment and potential consequences for future terrorism is the number of foreign fighters in Iraq and Syria. So as ISIL faces military defeat, particularly in Syria, we found that those foreign fighters are now likely to be redirected elsewhere. The estimates on the number of foreign fighters going to Syria suggest that there are around 40,000. Of course, it's very difficult to know how many of those remain in the country, how many of those have been killed, how many of those are trapped there and lack the resources to come back to their countries of origin. So this chart provides an estimate there of the number of foreign fighters and the numbers who have returned home. So the highest number coming from elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa, but also a high number from Russia and Eurasia and from Europe. So there are some concerns there about the security risk posed by returning foreign fighters, even though ISIL has been more or less defeated militarily in Syria and in Iraq. So that was sort of a very brief overview of the findings of the 2018 GTI. So I look forward to answering as many of your questions as possible, and I would encourage any of you, if we aren't able to get your questions, aren't able to answer them, to go to the website, download the report. Everything I've talked about today is discussed in much more detail there. So, Michelle.
Thank you, Tom. And we've been having people throughout your presentation start to type their questions into the question or chat box on the side of your screen. Please continue to do so. I may be grouping some of these questions. There are some repetition, but I've also seen that people are starting conversations amongst themselves within this chat box, and go ahead and do that. We will share the link to the report. Somebody did ask, so don't worry, we'll share this material with you too. What I think is really an interesting finding, and it's come through the last couple of years in the index, but something that I think that is a good contribution coming through the aggregation and analysis of this data is the fact that the environments that lead to terrorism tend most often to be environments where there are already existing violent conflicts or where there's state-sponsored terror. So we saw that of the 10 countries most impacted by terrorism, all were involved in at least one violent conflict, and 8 were involved in a major war with at least 1,000 battle deaths. And those 10 countries accounted for 84% of all deaths from terrorism in 2017. Now, if you look at the countries that also have state-sponsored terror, so political terror like extrajudicial killings, torture, and imprisonment without trial, it's 99%. So that means that we can start to look at some of these underlying environmental factors that support the increase of terrorism. When we look at more developed economies, Western Europe, the United States, for instance, we see that issues of alienation and grievance tend to be key drivers of terrorist activity. And I think that this is particularly interesting because it starts to move our attention towards how we're addressing this issue of terrorism, and that while there needs to be a counterterrorism approach that can deal with groups like ISIL, there also needs to be a concurrent approach to address some of these drivers of terrorist activity that we can identify through an index like this. One of the questions that is coming up in a few different ways, Tom, is around the definition of terrorism that we're using. I mentioned at the beginning that we use the definition that is set out by the START Center at the University of Maryland. And we use their definition because they're the ones who put together the most comprehensive database on terrorist activity that exists, the Global Terrorism Database. And in order to produce this type of quantitative research, we have variable. So we're using that database, we're using START's definition, and we construct the index from there. What's interesting about the index is that it can start to take into account multidimensional factors. It doesn't just look at deaths from terrorism. As Tom explained at the beginning, we're looking at the impact of terrorism to the best of our abilities. So Tom, one of the questions is really how we define terrorism. How is it differentiated from murder through organized crime, mass shootings, acts of war? Where do we see a difference in these types of violence or violent conflict? And then how do we look at both quantitative and qualitative measures of terrorism in this index?
Sure. No, I think it's an excellent question. And as you say, we use the definition which is put forward by START, which I'll just briefly go over. So START's definition of terrorism has a number of different elements. So the first of which is that the incident has to be intentional. It's the result of a conscious calculation on the part of the perpetrator. Secondly, the incident has to have some level of violence or the threat of violence. So that can be property damage or violence against people. And the third definition, the third element, which I think comes up in a number of questions that people are asking, is that the perpetrators must be subnational actors, non-state actors. So the database that we use doesn't include acts of state terrorism, extrajudicial killings, things like that. That's not to say that those types of violence aren't important or shouldn't be considered. Those are the kind of things that we include in other IEP research outputs. It's definitely a part of the Global Peace Index, for example. It's just not included in this particular definition of terrorism. And then there are three other criteria, two of which have to be met in order for the act to be considered terrorism. It has to be a violent act that's aimed at attaining a political, economic, religious, or social goal. Secondly, the violent act has to include evidence of an intention to coerce or intimidate or convey some other message to a larger audience than to the immediate victims. So that's the terror element, if you like. And then the third extra criteria there is that the violent act was outside the precepts of international humanitarian law. And I think what's good about this definition is that there's discussion around whether a certain group has been classified as by, say, for example, the State Department or a particular government of a country, and that is treated as the kind of defining factor of whether an act is a terrorist act or whether a group is a terrorist group. The definition that START uses that kind of neatly circumvents this problem by saying it doesn't matter if the group is a declared terrorist group or not. What matters is if it fits these particular criteria for it to be a terrorist act. So I think that covers most of what people are wanting to know about how terrorism is defined. Sorry, Michelle, what was the second part of the question?
Qualitative data versus quantitative data. How is the GTD collected, and how are those different types of data used in the GTI?
The GTD itself, it relies on open source data, so it's a process of collecting information from news reports, for example, verifying that, going through it, coding it to make sure it fits the various criteria related to terrorism. So it's not an automatic process. There's always going to be a qualitative element, a normative element. People might disagree on whether a particular act meets those criteria that I outlined. It's kind of an unavoidable problem. But in the GTD, START does have a variable that they code for as to whether something is potentially not terrorism. So they have a doubt terrorism variable. And in the GTI, we only include those acts which are definitely considered terrorism. We don't include acts that are considered doubtful or possibly not incidents of terrorism. Then in the report itself, we bring in a whole range of other data. So we data on various socioeconomic factors. We look at attitudinal surveys. So we're really interested, as Michelle said before, it's not only just looking and tracking at terrorism, it's really trying to understand what are those factors that drive terrorism, that cause terrorism, the kind of enabling environment for terrorism, if you like.
And Tom, there's another question asking.
1 second, the lights have just gone out here, so I'll just be 1 second.
No problem.
Okay, we're back.
There's another question asking, are there any trends you can point to, or is there any analysis you can point to that looks at the impact in certain countries of homegrown terrorism versus terrorism from abroad or international terrorism?
Do they have reference to a specific country there? Do people have a specific country in mind, or?
No, but maybe we could consider the United States or a country in Western Europe that might come to mind.
I think we find that with the majority of terrorism that is carried out even in Western Europe and North America, it tends to be domestic terrorism. The majority of perpetrators of terrorist acts tend to have grown up within a country. There are, of course, so there are occasionally sort of international terrorist plots that involve coordination between groups across countries. But we find that with the increased emphasis on counter-terrorism, on counterintelligence, that those kind of plots are much more difficult to carry out. But we found that over the past 3 years, particularly in Western Europe and North America, a lot of terrorism tends to be more opportunistic. It's planned over a much shorter scale, become radicalized in a very short time frame. And that kind of terrorist activity is much more difficult for intelligence agencies to intercept, pick up, and to deal with. But yeah, I think that's what. Yeah.
Tom, you're cutting out a little bit, so can you make sure that you speak clearly into the microphone? There's a number of questions asking about India being in the bottom 10 of the index. What are the drivers of terrorism there in India? Who do we see responsible? And the relationship as well with Pakistan. Does that figure in?
Sure. I mean, as the situation with India's score on the Global Terrorism Index is similar in many ways to its score on the Global Peace Index. India, of course, a very large country with a very large population, but also a very long border. And as a result of that, there are a number of conflicts, small minor conflicts. Sorry, am I echoing a bit here?
A little bit.
Okay.
Just speak slowly, and I think you'll be fine.
Sure. So, but the majority of terrorism, I think the largest terrorist group in India is a Maoist rebel group that's been responsible for the majority of deaths from terrorism in India. But I mean, even though India is amongst the top 10 on the index, because of the way the index is banded, because of that logarithmic banding, there's still a fairly large discrepancy between the number of deaths in India and then the number of deaths in Syria or Iraq, for example.
And Tom, maybe that also then leads to another question where somebody is asking for an explanation about the impact of terrorism in Latin America. How is it that these countries that may be in conflict or have lower rates of terrorism compared to Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, some of the countries that are very bottom of the index?
It's a very good question. I think over the past 20 years, there have been some countries in Central and South America that have had high levels of terrorism. So if you look in Colombia, terrorist groups like FARC have been, carried out a number of terrorist attacks. In Peru, there's a history with violent terrorism there as well. Part of the issue in Central and South America is that because a lot of the violence is related to criminal activity, to cartel activity in Mexico, for example, it's certainly, there are lots of violent attacks against civilian, but it doesn't meet that criteria, the criteria outlined in the definition of terrorism that START uses, related to having a sort of economic or social or political or religious goal. Because it's sort of founded in criminal activity, organized criminal activity, that's the reason why you see those countries don't have as high a score.
Tom, we have another question about the economic impact. What's the cost of terrorism, and do we have a sense of how much we're spending on trying to counter and prevent it?
So in the report, we do have a model that puts the impact of terrorism to the global economy at 52 billion. Unfortunately, though, it's very difficult to track the full extent of the real cost of terrorism. The way we build our model on the economic impact of terrorism is the same way we build it for the Global Peace Index. So we look at those people who are killed, we look at their lost lifetime earnings and economic productivity, and try to put a number on that. But of course, the economic impact of terrorism is multifaceted. So there's the impact on people's behavior, whether they go out, they're shopping less. There's the impact on tourism, for example. And then, as you alluded to, there's the cost of counter-terrorism. The issue there is that it's not an easy thing to put a price on, say, intelligence budgets. They tend to be fairly opaque. It's difficult to know how much is being spent exactly. And then, of course, a lot of the costs of counterterrorism are just sort of subsumed more generally into the costs of policing. So to put an exact figure on it is particularly difficult, but I think with some confidence that it's probably considerably higher than the 52 billion that we have in the report.
Wonderful. Thank you. I'm just going through some of these questions right now to sort through them. In the meantime, I think it's always interesting to ask you, Tom, since you have been in London the last couple of days and have been witness to or participated in dozens and dozens of media interviews around this report. What has stood out to you that the media is asking? Is there anything that you think is, what's the most interesting finding for you as the researcher on this project?
With regards to the media interest, because a lot of the interviews we're doing are with organizations in Western Europe and North America, they're particularly interested in the findings on the increase of far-right political terrorism. And I think that kind of concern is reflected in a general unease about the political and social climate at the moment. It's not directly related to terrorism, but you only have to look at what's happening in France at the moment, with the riots happening in Paris. We've seen an increase in populism, political populism in North America and in Western Europe. So there are a lot of factors there which seem to be pointing to a general unease, a general political and social unease, distrust of elites, a kind of breakdown of the existing political order. And I think people see the rise in far-right terrorism as playing into that. So people have been particularly interested in that story. I think also people interested in just the fact that there's been such a precipitous drop in the level of terrorism related to ISIL. And I think what people want to know naturally then is what happens next, what comes next, whether we see whether ISIL will reform, whether it splinters off, if we've dealt with terrorism at least partially in the Middle East, where does it go now? And whether this downward trend, we see a reversion to the levels of terrorism we saw for, say, the first 10 years of the 21st century, or whether that trend, the upward trend, reasserts itself in the coming years. So I think that's most of what people have been interested, and I think that reflects my own interests as a researcher too. I'm working on the Global Terrorism Index.
Thanks. There's a lot of questions about state-sponsored terror, and as Tom explained in the beginning, the definition forth by those who construct the database does not include state-sponsored terrorism. So to a certain extent, we're limited there in trying to look at that full range. But Tom, I thought the way that you presented some of the advantages of that was meaningful, and maybe you could reiterate why that's important, but also link some of this work to the Global Peace Index, because the Terrorism Index is just one of 23 indicators of our Global Peace Index, and the Global Peace Index can give a much more nuanced view of what's happening in terms of the state of violence and conflict and peace in the world that takes into account many different types of violence and will account for some of the conflict and violence that may be state-sponsored.
Sure, yeah, and I think just want to make a distinction up front here between sort of state terror against its own citizens, so sort of the state carrying out extrajudicial killings and assassinations and so on, and then state-sponsored terror, which I think there's been some questions as well about, say, Iranian patronage of Hezbollah, which has been listed as a terrorist organization by the State Department and so on. So I think with regards to measuring the impact of state-sponsored terror and which states are the sort of greatest promoters of terrorism, it's just very difficult to find meaningful, comparable data in that regard. So to talk about which states are the greatest supporters of terrorist groups, it's really not an exercise that's possible quantitatively. So that's the reason why we don't place an emphasis on that in the report. And then of course there's the question of exactly how you define state patronage of terrorism and terrorist groups. Yes, and as you said, Michelle, with regards to state terror, there's something called the political terror scale, which is a crucial part of the Global Peace Index. It's one of the Global Peace indicators. But again, when you're looking at things like imprisonment without trial, extrajudicial killings, obviously governments are very reticent to provide clear information on the level of state terror. So you're relying on secondary sources, you're relying on civil society, NGOs to provide the information on that kind of activity. So it's absolutely, we certainly recognize that state terror, state-sponsored terror are very important issues related to violence, but it's something that we can only really cover in a more comprehensive index of violence like the Global Peace Index, rather than something as specific as the Global Terrorism Index.
Thanks, Tom. So somebody has a question about the issue of cyber terrorism and its impact on subverting democracy or democratic institutions. And, that isn't something that we are measuring specifically in this index. If you have any comments, Tom, please do share them. But I also wanted to point everybody to the fact that we have included a range of essays in the back of our report. We do so to try to get a broader expert analysis around some of the issues that aren't measured. There is an essay this year discussing cyber terrorism, and that is in the back of the full report that we'll send you the link to. But if you have any comments here, Tom, please do share them.
Sure. I mean, no, I would reiterate that we have the expert essay on cyber terrorism. I certainly don't feel that I'm qualified to offer any extension to that essay. Just a general point to note that yes, cyber terrorism is only going to become more of an issue in future. Again, it's something that's very difficult to quantify the scope and the impact of cyber terrorism, but certainly it's an issue that will only become more prominent over the coming years. Sorry, Michelle, I noted that there was perhaps a question. I'm not sure if it's been addressed in discussions in the comments about the discrepancy in deaths between the GTI and the GTD.
Yes, Mauricio Mechulam, who is a a friend of the Institute for Economics and Peace in Mexico, who is an expert around these topics and has been sharing on the chat some of his resources and some of the Mexico-specific experience for some of our participants, has asked, how come the Global Terrorism Database, which is the database we use for this index, has a different number of reported deaths than what IEP is reporting in the GTI?
The reason for that is it has to do with what I talked about earlier with regard to the variable in the GTD, which looks at incidence of terrorism is doubted or not. So my understanding is that the report that summarized the GTD that was put out by START included those deaths which were doubted as terrorism, so they used the full database, whereas the GTI only uses those deaths which are not coded as doubt terrorism. So from my understanding, that explains the discrepancy between the two figures.
Thanks, Tom. So I think sort of our question, we had one on asking about increases of terrorism in that country, groups and trends. But I'm wondering, Tom, if you could also just share some kind of final thoughts about thinking about some of these emerging trends that we've pointed to in the report, whether they're geographic or they're looking at rising far-right terrorism in Western countries. If there's anything you wanted to add based on some of this idea that the landscape of terrorism is shifting, and particularly how we can think about it from a peace building and conflict prevention lens.
Sure, absolutely. So I think one of the things that we looked at in the report, and we didn't have too much time to discuss it in the presentation today, was on those patterns in terrorist recruitment. And particularly for people who, I'm sure some of them involved in the discussion here, who are peace practitioners, involved with peace organizations. I think the key role that people can play there is looking at the drivers of terrorism, the drivers of terrorist recruitment, particularly because for states, for governments, the lever that they're most likely to pull is increased counter-terrorism spending, increased intelligence gathering, increased efforts to reduce terrorism, like having more police on the streets, more military on the streets, more bollards to prevent car attacks, and so on and so on. And there's no doubt that those kind of efforts, I think it's fairly safe to say that those efforts have been successful in reducing the level of terrorism. So you take Europe, for example, there's been a 75% drop in the number of deaths from terrorism. I think what's interesting there, though, is if you look at the number of terrorist incidents in Europe, they've actually increased slightly from 2016 to 2017. So you've had a lot of smaller attacks. So if you look at France and Belgium and Germany, which have had high levels of terrorism in 2014, 2015, and 2016, in 2017, there were actually still hundreds of attacks in those three countries combined, but no single attack killed more than 3 people. So what that suggests is that the enabling environment for terrorism, the drivers of terrorism, the issue with terrorism hasn't gone away. And even though the states and governments have tremendous resources to disrupt terrorist plots, to disrupt terrorism planning, the really hard work is in reducing that broader enabling environment for terrorism. And I think that's really the key importance of the kind of research that goes on in the GTI and the kind of research that's done by peace building organizations is really getting at how it's possible to build peace, to build resilient communities, to prevent that enabling environment for terrorism, for political discord, for social discord to grow. So I think that's the point I'd like to emphasize and to finish on, I think.
Thanks. Darren, our Director of Communications, is going to share with you all the links to the reports that we mentioned, the Terrorism Index, as well as the Global Peace Index, once we wrap up here. But I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I hope that one of the things that we can get out of a briefing like this is that Data is important, and it's important for us to invest in the research and the data so that we have an understanding of what is actually going on in the world. This is underfunded research. We're all looking for support from START to IEP, and we hope that you'll join us in a variety of ways to do that, whether it's participating in our online discussions, sharing the materials with your peers and with your networks, or supporting our organizations as we continue to research on these important ideas. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope you'll join us for a future briefing.